Cliff is the founder of the Agile 2 Academy and the lead author on the book Agile 2. Howard Weiner is the partner in the Agile 2 Academy and is the author of Agile Enterprise Risk Management. And I'm also a partner here. And we're happy to share with you the nuts and bolts of Agile 2. We think this is a far better way to become agile in your organization. So take it away, Cliff.
Okay. Okay. So very importantly, Agile 2 doesn't throw Agile out. Agile 2 builds on the Agile Manifesto. The Agile Manifesto is not perfect. There are some problems with it based on our research, but there are problems with most good things. It was a very important document. It still is. There's a lot of insight in it. But interestingly, it really takes a lot of experience to be able to see what was really intended. If you don't have experience working in organizations and you read the Agile Manifesto literally, you'll probably draw the wrong conclusions. That's an important thing to realize, that none of this is cookbook where you can just memorize some rules or maxims and then execute that. That's not how this works. You need experience and judgment. The Agile Manifesto, its principles and its values really are kind of reminders. They're not rules, they're reminders, but then you have to apply judgment. Agile 2 is the same way, but let me pause on that for a moment. So what did the Agile movement give us? Back in 2001, and even before that, there were a lot of things that kind of are viewed as, well, that was the beginnings of Agile. I remember I was 20 years into my career at the time. I was CTO of a company that built things, really hard, difficult things at scale. And so we were kind of in the middle of that. We adopted extreme programming. But, the Agile movement was kind of a rejection of some dysfunction that really arose during the 90s. The 90s, I like to call it the methodology craze. Before that, people didn't use methodologies. And a lot of IT projects were highly agile. I was in some very agile IT projects during the 80s. But in the 90s, it kind of went sideways. And we started to see a lot of PMI-based, waterfall, requirements phase, design phase, and all that kind of stuff. In the 80s, we often had things carved up that way, but it operated differently. If you had a design phase, the intent was you created an initial design. And then during development, the design would change. That was considered normal. But then in the 90s, we started to see these rigid phases with things locked down and requirements passed as big documents. So the Agile movement was really kind of a rejection of those pathologies. And it reminded us, again, of some things that really work. Phased software development usually doesn't work. You have to evolve. You have to allow a design to evolve over time as you learn more, as you're building it. It's not like building a bridge where you can look at it and see what's missing and so on. Software is too complicated to design it all up front. So you have to allow the design to evolve. You can't phase it where the phases there's no changes. You can't design and have the design fixed. Also, the idea that what you want, that what you need to build is nonsense. You might in some cases. I worked in some projects. Some of the work I did was building compilers during the 80s, and we often knew exactly what it had to do. It was defined by the language reference manual. But that's kind of an edge case. In most business applications, you don't really know what you need. You have to build some and try and get feedback from people and allow it to evolve. And so this, locking down requirements does not make sense. And you need to, assume that business users, the stakeholders, don't really know what they need. And it's almost impossible to fully design software up front for the reasons I mentioned. And another pathology that arose is creating big requirements documents and then handing that off. That doesn't work either because, again, you don't really know what you want. Plus, people don't learn well from a big, thick written document. They need it. If you give someone requirements, they need to learn the requirements. They can't just execute them. They need to learn them. They need to build a model in their head of what those requirements are. And just reading it from a dry document is not a good way to do that. And trying to build the whole big thing in one go, instead of building pilots and prototypes and early versions and adding things to that, trying to build like the final thing is ridiculous. It's a horribly risky thing to even attempt for something really complicated. And big teams don't work. We need small groups of people that interact in a fluid way, but we need to try to make things small and tractable so we can get our hands around it. And small groups of people, lots of small groups of people is more effective than a just big pool of people where you task things out. And micromanaging people just neurologically is awful. It makes people lose their drive and inspiration and constantly being bossed around and tasked out and told what to do. That's not the way to inspire people and get the best out of them. And also don't trust that you actually have the right design until you see it working. A great design document is beautiful maybe to some people, not me, but some people think, oh, it looks like a great design. But then when you try to build it, the design's actually not right. So you cannot really trust it until you see things working. And building quality in, you can't bolt quality on. And also, spending more hours in the day doesn't mean that you're making progress. We need to be results oriented and outcome oriented. And we also need to always be thinking about how we're doing things, and whether I personally don't like this 2-week retrospective. I like to build constant reflection into our daily activity where we're always thinking about how we're doing things. But that's another discussion. However you do it, it's very important to always be improving how you do things. So, the Agile movement reminded, none of this is new. None of it's new. Frederick Brooks wrote about some of this. But the Agile movement reminded us. It put it back in the center. It said, wait a second, remember these kinds of things. That was significant. And, so we owe the Agile movement that. But things went sideways. We also saw arising a lot of kind of extreme interpretations of Agile ideas. Like teams don't need leaders except to remove impediments. They sure do. And I don't know who of you have read the book Accelerate by Nicole Forsgren and Jess Humble and Jean Kim, but her research, which is a very deep statistical research of outcomes and effectiveness, is a book about DevOps. They found that the teams that were most effective were the ones that had good leaders. And they describe what that is. And what they describe is almost verbatim what's known as transformational leadership. And Google found the same thing in their research. So leadership is really important. It's, leaders are not just, people who make suggestions and then step back. Good leadership is involved and inquisitive and saying, what about this? And talking to individuals and very much in the middle of it, but not micromanaging. And the idea that everything should be face-to-face is nonsense. If you look at how collaboration about very complex things happens in the real world outside of IT, like in the sciences and other fields, it's collaboration mostly is through writing. It's mostly through writing about complex things, because in written form, you can connect all the dots and people can consider it in a way that cognitively works for them. And then they can have discussions after they've had time to consider what you wrote down. So real effective collaboration is not just a bunch of people talking. Talking is important. That's a very important component of it, but it's not the whole thing. It's an important element. Have face-to-face communication is a very important element of effective collaboration and communication, but it's only one of many elements. And the idea that everybody has to sit together to kind of enforced collaboration. Uh, so many people tell me I cannot focus in these rooms where I constantly see things happening in the room. I can't focus in that setting. I always feel like I'm going to be interrupted, and that's why people wear headphones. It's a terrible arrangement. It's not how to get people to collaborate by putting them all next to each other. That's not how you do it. And that, teams must be completely autonomous. If teams were autonomous, each team would be a product. If you have a multi-team product, they're not completely autonomous. A team cannot decide autonomously how it's going to test the product. They can't, because what they do has to be the same approach, the same strategy as the other teams for the product. So you're not fully autonomous. Autonomy is a matter of degree. It's not an absolute. And so we need to stop saying from the outset, oh, teams are autonomous. No, they're not. Teams are empowered. People are empowered, but it's issue specific. Empowered about what? And multiple teams will self-organize. They don't. They do not. At almost every case I see, one of the main problems in organizations that have lots of teams is there's a very, if the senior leaders assume the teams will coordinate among themselves, it's usually very terrible. That coordinate, and what's needed was positive forms of leadership between the teams. And a culture that encourages them to reach out and coordinate on their own. But that has to be generated. That has to be generated by leadership to instill that drive into people to get them to start coordinating. That expectation has to be set. And it's not done just by issuing a memo. It's done by showing them and by demonstrating it and making it happen, and then stepping back and then stepping back in and generating that culture and that behavioral norm over time. And then they become more autonomous. And always trust the team. So I'm not going to read through all the rest of these, but the point is that a lot of good ideas kind of got twisted into extreme variations that don't work. Extremes usually don't work unless you have an extreme situation. And luckily, a lot of people have realized these things. I mentioned Nicole Forsgren's book, Accelerate. I highly recommend it. By the way, there's a whole chapter in it on leadership. And if you look at things that were written in the early days of Agile versus what's been written in the last 10 years, the narratives are quite different. There's a lot about leadership and what good leadership is, and about the role of managers. Managers are very important. This book, Seat at the Table by Mark Schwartz, I actually worked for him. He was a CIO of a major government agency in the US. And, he talks about what the role managers need to play. And granted, there are a lot of bad managers, but, getting rid of managers doesn't solve the bad manager problem. It replaces one problem with another. There's no automatic, easy, structural or process solution to these issues. These are behavioral issues. And so, so there are new narratives around this stuff, narratives that are smarter and more informed by what we actually know from research about human behavior and organizational culture and behavioral psychology. We need to let the old stuff be what it was, and we need to go forward. And as good as the Agile Manifesto was, it left out some gigantic things like elephants, like product design. So the manifesto mentions, well, the customer and the user, but product design's a thing. Apple has a whole organization for product design. It's not something you just wing it, at least not for something that really has to sell well in a competitive market. Product design needs to be thought about in a system-oriented way, and you might need product design teams And if you do need product, just throwing UX people onto development teams might not cut it. It might, depends what you're building, but it might not. You might need real product concepts, that are then built by a group of teams that focus on that product. And if you do have a product design team, how do they work with the development teams? That's a critical thing. You don't want another handoff. And so what if you have 10 development teams or 30 development teams, and you have a product design team that's like working with users and bringing users in and showing them mock-ups and showing them things, or doing participatory design? How do you bring the developers into that discussion? How do you do that? There's some ideas in the Agile 2 book, but there's no one answer. But that's a problem you have to solve. And there isn't a process framework for that, and there shouldn't be. There might be ideas for it, but you have to solve that problem in a way that works for your product and your organization. And data. The Agile Manifesto mentions software, but it didn't mention data. What the heck? Data is even more important than software, some would argue. Andrew Ng, the machine learning guru from Stanford, says organizations should base their systems around data, not around services. But whatever, data is hugely important. So how come we're not talking about data in an Agile context? The Agile Manifesto didn't mention data. Well, we need to bring data into the inner circle of what matters and be thinking about data. And Agile 2 talks about at least the 3 perspectives for data, but I'm not going to get into that here. And also, the Agile Manifesto, as good as it was what a bunch of guys came up with on a weekend. That's all it was. It was the 4 values, the principles, a few of them created later by email. But in that weekend, they came up with 4 values. That's it. That's the Agile Manifesto. If you look at the manifesto published, that's the part that's copyrighted. The second page is not copyrighted, and it has those principles. The 4 values is what they created in that weekend. And, it's what they were able to come up with, like off the cuff. We need to be more thoughtful. We need to bring in what's known in these different fields and be real about it. Let's be professional about it. There's a huge amount of research in leadership theory and behavioral science and cognitive science about how people communicate, how they create, how they how they think, how people, how groups of people behave. Guess what? Groups of people don't usually self-organize well. When they get to performing, usually they're performing suboptimally. They're performing, they got past storming, but they're not performing that well. That's the typical case. So that's why leadership's important, but we need the right kinds of leadership. And unfortunately, there's no magic answer for this. There's no Agile framework that will solve this for us. These are behavioral issues. You have to change people's behavior. It's a hard problem. There's no shortcut. In the work we've done in Agile 2 Academy, we've identified 3 critical, pivotal elements that are necessary for agility. Culture, knowledge, and behavior. Culture and behavior are interlinked. Culture influences behavior, and behavior influences culture. What is culture? Culture is kind of like your foundational attitudes about things and expectations. Like, we expect people to like have integrity, or, if you look at like an organization that like has a very, a mission where they're trying to make a world a better place. The culture generally is people who are supportive and generative and good-hearted and so on, and they expect each other to behave well. I mean, they don't always, of course, they're humans, but that's kind of the culture. If you look at a criminal organization, just to pick an extreme opposite, the culture is very different. They kind of expect each other to stab each other in the back. That's kind of their norm. So they're always looking over their shoulder. Your culture has a huge impact on people's behavior. So culture is foundational. And culture sets the expectations for behavior, that we behave in certain ways. And most of Agile 2 is about behavior. It's about behaviors that make agility possible, that promote agility promoting behaviors. And you also need knowledge. And this is where things like DevOps and Lean and Flow come in. These are patterns for how to organize work. They're solution patterns. That you need that mental toolbox of those patterns. But by itself, it's not enough. You need the culture and the behaviors. And in organizations that have high actual agility, what we see is that they have very little process. They have process, but they create process where and when they need it. They don't start with process. What we see is they tend to be very issue focused, where issues arise and people right away raise attention to those issues. And they ask the right people. They say, what should we do about this? And conversations ensue. And there might be people who write emails and then they write up their thoughts, or they call a meeting and they discuss it and they bring in the people who need to be in the discussion. And then very crucially, they quickly make a decision about what to do next, like maybe to try something or to prototype something or to try an approach and test it. They don't wait. They constantly are moving things forward. And that's the behavior. That's not a process. This kind of activity happens outside of process. Agility does not result from process. It results from the ad hoc behavior that people exhibit when process breaks, when an issue comes up that's unexpected. Okay, so in classic Agile, there's some things that weren't quite right. As and I went through some of the strengths that what Agile gave us, and so those are good things. But some of the interpretations weren't quite right, and the extremes aren't right almost always. And so, what are those things, and what does Agile 2 try to improve on? Well, classic Agile, the way it's usually applied, has an excessive focus on teams. So is the team, which is interesting to me because the Agile Manifesto's very first value begins with the word individuals. Individuals and interactions. It doesn't say teams, it says individuals. But somehow we've made it all about teams. The team this, the team that, and it's even perverted the whole approach to leadership that we see in Agile teams. Now, where a Scrum Master is always talking to the team. Well, why isn't the Scrum Master talking to the individuals in the team? What you learn from adaptive leadership theory is that when you lead a group, you're actually leading a collection of individuals. You have to develop a relationship uniquely with each individual on the team because people are motivated differently. They're not all the same. You have to find out their individual challenges and be checking in on them individually, not always talking to the team. You need to talk to the people in the team and occasionally talk to the whole team, but most of your interactions should be with the individuals. And Agile 2, focuses on leadership, which includes adaptive leadership with individuals, but also looking at the product. And you often need many teams building a product. The product is what the organization cares about. That's where the focus needs to be. If an issue arises that maybe affects another team, you need to say so, not say, well, that's their problem because our team is only doing this. No, you need to be thinking about the product. And original Agile absolutely was anti-management. This is well documented. There were some individuals in the group that created the Agile Manifesto that have a very anti-management viewpoint, almost like in a toxic level. And that was kind of reflected in what got documented in the Agile Manifesto. And managers play a crucial role. Google has documented what is needed from good managers. And two of the traits are that good managers are empowering leaders. They empower the people they lead, but they're also decisive. Those are not contradictory things. And good leadership is really what it's all about. If you want agility, it's really all about having the right kinds of leadership that create the right culture, that encourage the behavioral norms so that people will step out of their lane and will be proactive about things. That doesn't happen automatically. You have to create that expectation, and the leaders need to do that. And the rigid extremes, today, again, every day I end up in a debate with someone on LinkedIn about test-driven development, and that someone writes, it's the only way to do it. Anyone who's not doing the test-driven development doesn't know what they're doing. These extremes, we need to give people agency about how they work and not say, I figured out the best way. Everybody has to do things that way. Extremes don't work. People are different. We're neurologically diverse. A practice that works well for one person might not work well for another. And we need to give them the agency to decide what works best for them in terms of how they get their work done within reason. The context matters. What are we really trying to do? You can't just take like everybody do TDD. Well, what if we're building software for an airplane? Is TDD, well, maybe, but maybe not. It always matters what's the context. And the Agile community became very non-technical. We started to see a lot of Agile coaches and Scrum Masters who had never written a line of code. And, I've known some Agile coaches who had never written a line of code who were really good. So you can't categorically say, oh, those people don't know what they're doing. Some of them do. But it's really helpful to understand how the work is done. A coach or a Scrum Master is a leader. Leadership is influence. And, if you're in an influential role with a group, you're a leader by definition. And it really helps to understand the work. If they're programmers and you've never written a line of code, you're really handicapped. You might still be good at your job, but you really kind of are missing a powerful tool that if you were to learn more about it, it would really help. And so this non-technical viewpoint of Agile, you don't need to understand DevOps or you don't need to understand programming. It's nonsense. So it's really helpful to understand how the work is done. And then the obsession with these frameworks like Scrum and SAFe and so on, they attack the problem the wrong way. They start with process, but process, as we explained, is not what yields agility. Process is something that you design for your situation. Your process should change depending on what you're doing. And the product teams should be defining the process that they need for the current problem. It should be like what they start, like when they do their sprint zero or whatever they're doing, they should think, what process do we need right now? And to make sure the tests get run frequently. And so what should our process be? A month later, it might change. What should our process be now? You should always be adjusting your process and deciding what your process is, not taking someone's process and then implementing that. And you should be using ideas like lean and flow and so on as part of your toolbox to inform you, but then design your own process using those ideas. So, Agile 2, there's a lot in Agile 2, but, it's basically a compilation of things we already know that brings them together. And, to kind of roll it up and summarize it, these things I think are kind of the top level things, classic Agile about teams self-organized, Agile 2 is more about positive forms of leadership and so on. And let's actually kind of go through some and drill in a little bit. And I just picked 4 of these, just in the interest of time. But if we do have time, I'm happy to go through some of the others. So like teams self-organize without interference. Well, the actual research shows that they don't. I'm sorry, but that's the actual research. You know, in fact, there's a whole theory, a leadership theory called leader-member exchange theory, which attempts to explain what actually happens. And interestingly, this also happens with chimpanzees, who are our closest relatives in another species. What tends to happen in a team that has no designated leader, and by the way, designated leader is not a magic solution, because you can have a toxic leader. So it comes down to having the right kinds of leadership. That's the hard problem we need to solve, not get rid of leaders. That doesn't solve it. It replaces it with another problem, because what tends to happen in a leaderless team is a leader emerges. You end up with a leader. You always end up with a leader. And what tends to happen is that someone emerges, and it can be someone who's benign or very toxic, but basically they achieve popularity or dominance. And then they create an inner circle, either intentionally or unintentionally. There tends to be a few people who kind of orbit the leader, who are loyal to the leader to some degree, or support the leader, or align with the leader, and that gives that leader strength. And then it excludes other people, either explicitly or tacitly, and this is just a natural cycle that tends to happen. And in the Tuckman model, when your teams start performing, what's happened is that a leader emerged and the inner circle formed, and then there was conflict, but things quieted down. Basically, the people not in the inner circle got subjugated and basically learned to just keep their mouths closed. And so the team's performing, but it's not performing as well as it could. What we really need is we need to make sure that a toxic leader does not emerge. We need to make sure that, if a leader does emerge, they're a good leader, which means they're open, they're inclusive, they try to bring everyone into the inner circle. And if we're nervous that won't happen, you designate the right person. What's interesting is that the original Scrum paper from 1986 uses the IBM PC team as an example, but that team was handpicked by a senior IBM manager, and there were people with substantial leadership experience on that team, including someone who was in charge of manufacturing a product, was a manufacturing manager. There was a software programming lead. There was a lead programmer. And there were several other people who had like lead role experience. And, so then they were challenged, and there was time pressure too, which changes people's behavior. When there's time pressure, people become a lot more collaborative because they're worried about time and they know we have to work together. So time pressure was a huge factor, but there was a lot of leadership experience on that team. And you want to make sure you have the right kinds of leadership. So good leaders are always looking for others who have the right traits or can learn. There's a lot written on this. There's a lot of research about positive forms of leadership and transformational leadership. I would encourage you to look at. And by the way, you probably are wondering, what about servant leadership? Well, servant leadership is an important leadership mode, but it's just one mode of leadership. It's not sufficient. It's good leaders behave as servant leaders some of the time, but they also need to behave in other ways. They need to be decisive when decisions need to get made. That sometimes a decision needs to be made and there's no consensus. And decisive time is everything in business. So decisiveness is important, but also empowering other people, advocating, representing a team or teams outside of the team, working with other managers to like line things up and negotiate things. There's a lot to leadership. As Peter Drucker said, you need an inside person, an outside person, a person of action. So servant leadership is an important leadership mode, but it's just the tiny slice of the leadership behaviors that are needed. And then, the old Agile idea, all the best communications face to face. No, it might not be. It depends. For simple things, yeah. But for complex things, it's often more effective to write it down and then give people a chance to think and then meet and then have the face-to-face discussion after they've had time to read and think and write about complex things. And people are different. Some people don't like to write. Some people don't like to talk. They prefer to write. So, there are neurological differences among people, and we need to respect that. And also, when you're talking, you can't think deeply. That's just a neurological fact. Because you're slightly distracted, because you have to be alert to what the other person is, their behavior and doing. You cannot think that you cannot really go to system two thinking, as Daniel Kahneman calls it. Whenever there's some kind of low-level distraction, you can't think deeply. Try solving a math problem while you're driving, even if you're driving a route that you know really well, that you could do in your sleep, so to speak. Go in your car and drive somewhere where you've driven it 100 times and try and do a math problem. You'll see that you can't. In order to think deeply, you have to have isolation. So there's a dog whining in the background. I apologize. I don't know what's going on with that. Okay. And then this obsessive team focus, it's always about the team. Well, no, it's not about the team. It's about the product. And teams exist to create products. The product is the thing. And so teams need to be thinking about the product, not about themselves. I've had programmers say to me, our team builds a microservice. If someone uses it wrong, that's their problem. No, it's the product problem. So it is your problem if someone uses your microservice wrong. We need to have a culture in which people are thinking about the product, not about their team. Each component in the system needs a testing strategy, as well as each product. And, testing strategies need to be multi-level. That's something that I teach in our DevOps course. And, you don't want a team deciding on the testing strategy for something that other people maintain as well necessarily. You want a consistent testing strategy that's used for all the components of that type. And so, the focus again needs to be on the product and on the things we're building, and not just like, oh, we're a team, we do things our way. That's just kind of the wrong mindset. And classic Agile, kind of promoted this idea that you have the product owner who's just focused on like the product requirements. It's like almost a very traditional view, and this comes from Scrum. The manifesto doesn't say this. The manifesto actually kind of is written very well in this respect. It mentions the customer and user, which is kind of how it should be. But Scrum took us down into a ditch with the product owner role. It's really a very dysfunctional anti-pattern role. You really need a product manager who kind of has a sense of responsibility for the product's success. And they need to understand how it's built too. They can't just focus on the outcome, because if they don't understand how it's built, they cannot have holistic discussions about trade-offs. Should we invest more in testing and building an automated test suite, or should we add more features? If they don't understand, the role that testing plays and kind of internalize those trade-offs, they can't really participate in good discussions about it. And, we show a Formula One team here because on a Formula One team, everybody on that team knows how those cars work and how they're built. Everybody, including the team owner. And usually these teams have a few managers. There will be a manager in charge of the racing operation, and there will be someone in charge of the technology for building the cars every year. because every year they build 2 new cars. And then there will be usually a business manager too, who goes and gets advertisers, sponsors. But those people all have to understand like how this stuff works and how it's built. Otherwise, they can't have good discussions about it. The McLaren team, the business manager, is a former driver. So you cannot just have blinders on and be a silo. You have to have everybody who interacts with the value stream has to have a basic understanding of every part of that value stream, not just their part. You don't have to be an expert. In fact, you can't be an expert in everything. But you need to have a basic understanding enough so you can have real discussions with people about trade-offs and about vision and so on. Vision's more than just the product. It's what the product will do and how are we going to do it? How's it going to work? How will we get there? That's part of the vision too. Well, that's, there are other aspects of Agile too, but those are the 4 that I promised to go through. And a little pivot here on a related topic. When Agile 2 was launched, a LinkedIn group was created, the Agile 2 LinkedIn group, and there are thousands of people in it now. But unfortunately, during that time, LinkedIn has changed, and they've kind of been dumbing it down in some ways. They've shortened the length of responses, so you can't go deep on things anymore. And they also have changed their algorithms so posts and articles don't reach all your followers, which is ridiculous. If someone develops followers on LinkedIn by writing content, like now LinkedIn has inserted themselves between that content author and their followers. And in order to make sure you can reach your followers, you have to pay to boost it. You actually have to pay to reach your own followers. And plus the whole discussion thread mechanism is broken. I don't know if you use LinkedIn, you might have noticed that you can't tell who's replying to who, or if you see a notice that someone said something in your notifications and click on what they said, it takes you to the LinkedIn thread, but then their post isn't there. And then you have to go back and try again. Eventually it shows up. Like, what the heck? It's just a mess. So we decided that it's no longer a good platform for discussing real stuff. LinkedIn seems to want to be about chatter, kind of like Facebook is, likes and chatter and, short, quick exchanges and so on. That's not what we want for Agile 2 and the stuff that we're working on in Agile 2 Academy, which we think is very good. We've been linking culture and agility, some really interesting work. So we created a new community called Constructive Agility, and Stephen's going to talk about that.
Yes, if you haven't joined our Constructive Agility Network, we encourage you to do so. It's free, as Cliff said. We've tried to design it around a lot of the feedback that the community is giving us, and we will have different threads and ways to go. And also, we hope this becomes a way where you can collaborate with other people and share. And this community is really something that hopefully will be very valuable to all of us and help us get around some of the obstacles that LinkedIn has put on us. We'll still have our LinkedIn network, but we think this Constructive Agility community is going to be a much better community for sharing and sharing ideas and connecting.
Thank you, Stephen. So we'd like to open it up. If you want to reach us, we're very easy to reach. We have a general, contact at Agile 2 Academy, and, just say who you want to talk to. Just mention, me or Stephen or Howard or some others. We actually, we're kind of a network, Marcel and Raj and Phil. Now we'd like to open it up for questions. And I'd like to start with Simon Harris posted a question in the Q&A This has been about why Agile's broken, Agile 2 in a nutshell, what's Agile 2 and how to use it. We tried to go over what Agile 2 is. Agile 2 is these things, basically. I mean, this is a roll-up. Agile 2 has 43 principles, which, believe it or not, is trimmed down. There were like, when we created Agile 2, there were like 100 principles, and we realized that was too many. Because the way Agile 2 was created was, we put a team together and we created a matrix of the skills we wanted, and which included product design and human resources, Agile human resources, system engineering, leadership, business, a whole bunch of different areas, like 10 different areas of expertise. And then the other criteria were twofold. You had to have shown that you think independently and don't just parrot standard stuff. And you had to not be deeply invested in maintaining the status quo. So like if Jeff Sutherland had emailed me and said, I want to be part of Agile 2, I would have said, no, you're too invested in keeping things the way they are. So once that team of 15 people was created, the first thing we did was do a retro, basically, on the state of Agile. And we had lots of discussions, most one-on-one discussions where we took notes, because it was a global team and it wasn't possible to get everybody on Zoom at once. There were people in Australia and India and all over the place. So, but then those things that came up in those one-on-ones would become discussion threads. And we had Slack and email and Google Docs. And so we had all of that, and it just turned out what people seemed to gravitate to was email, which surprised me. But we had email discussions where things were nested like 15 levels deep in different colors and so on. And what I would do is I would take what people were saying, and if there was a recurring issue that at least two people were talking about, I'd move that into an issue-focused Google Doc. And then people would have discussions in there. And eventually we would converge on a set of opinions about that issue. Oh yeah, so that convergence then got distilled into a set of insights, and then eventually a set of principles. And but you can roll that up too. And if you go to the Agile 2 website, there's a link that says Agile 2 in a nutshell, was like the name of this webinar. And it's kind of like a 1 or 2 pager summary of what Agile 2 is. Now, remember, Agile 2 is not a process. I mean, we feel that that's the wrong approach. It's not like Scrum or SAFe or something like that. It's like the Agile Manifesto, but much richer. It's a set of reminders. Like good leadership is important. There are actually 10 principles related to leadership, but it's not executable. So if you want to know what should I do, I'm sorry, it's not like that. And that's the way it is in real world things. If someone says, I want to start a business, what should I do? I'm sorry, there's no repeatable plan. It depends on the kind of business and the kind of team you're going to need and the kind of product and where you are and what your resources are. And I'm sorry, it's not a cookbook. If I want to teach a class of people, what's the plan? What's the process? I'm sorry, people teach differently, and many of them get good results with opposite approaches. So Agile 2 is like that, because that's how this is. You cannot give a cookbook for good leadership. So Agile 2 doesn't give you a set of steps, but for those people who want a set of steps for getting there, we did create something, and that's what this webinar is about, but we created a pathway called Constructive Agility, and it's a learning journey. And it's based around the idea that people need to define their own processes, but along the way, they need to define strategies that are ever evolving, but each strategy needs to start as an idea. We're going to approach, making sure that our people grow in the career, because that's good for the company. Grow in their career that aligns with what we need. Our strategy for that will be this and this. and then evolve that over time, and it becomes process eventually, but then you're always revisiting strategy. And along the way, you're using Agile 2 ideas to reflect on help you think, what should our process be? So that pathway, that learning journey, as we call that, constructive agility. And a big part of strategy is defining the culture that you want early on as a seed idea, and then elaborating that over time to build, and how do you build the right culture? So that's what we would offer in terms of what do I do? But it's a learning journey. It's not like an Agile process.
Cliff, we have another question from
Okay.
Modern Agile is seen also as an evolution of the classical Agile. Is Agile 2 a completely different thing, or are they complementary?
Yeah. Yeah, Agile 2 is not a completely different thing from Agile. We feel that, Agile got misinterpreted, and some things are not quite right. So Agile 2 seeks to correct the things that weren't right, but build on the things that were right, and to correct some bad things, like, original Agile, Agile gave us some really good ideas. So we want to preserve those, but we want to get rid of this stuff. We want to fix this stuff, and build on this stuff. So Agile 2 is, I hesitate to say an evolution, because it doesn't try to duplicate or repeat the good stuff. It tries to just correct the bad stuff, and add to the things that are missing. Things Agile left out. So original Agile kind of overwrites, Agile 2 kind of tries to overwrite part of original Agile and build on other parts of it, and then add things. But again, it's a set of ideas. It's not a plan. Yeah.
We got another question here from Jasper. In the Agile 2 book, you mentioned the lack of diversity of the original manifesto creators: male, white, American, European. How has this biased these principles? And he goes further to say, asking as a white male, middle-aged European.
Well, I don't know how it biased them, but the Agile 2 team was very diverse. It was a global team, and there were quite a few women in the group, and different cultures represented. And there are 2 individuals in that group from other who weren't from a North American culture or a Northern European culture, mentioned to me that actually one of them said that she felt that original Agile seemed to reflect a Silicon Valley mindset, and that there were things about it that didn't seem to align well with her own culture. So I think probably, at Agile 2, the group that created Agile 2 was intentionally global and diverse. And, I think that's a good thing. I think, the pandemic was terrible in many ways, but one of the things that was good was it kind of opened up the world. We now routinely talk to people who are all over the place, and I think that's a really good thing.
So one other question that came up, Cliff, is this being taped, and is it available to people?
Yeah, it is being recorded. And I'm surprised that a note didn't pop up on your screen reminding you, because let me double check. Yeah, it is recording. I thought that Zoom always gives you a notice to let you know it's being recorded.
You did give it earlier. It did.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, well, I think we're about at time right now. So do you have any parting words, Cliff?
What I do, and it would be that don't, please, I'm sure many of you don't, but Agile is not a process. There is no such thing as an Agile process. It's, Agile is about, like the Agile community likes to say, it's a mindset, but we need to go farther than that. What does that mean? And so there are ideas that we can try to apply about leadership and about these other things. And that's how you achieve agility. but it does take experience. It's not something you just execute. So if you want to have more discussions about this, reach out to us. We love to collaborate with people. We'd love to provide information on what we're doing, the constructive agility approach we're using with organizations. Very powerful. We have training, but it's not a certification mill. It's real stuff, leadership theory and some cognitive science and behavioral psychology. So anyway, and thank you for participating today.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great day or evening.